away at the age of 88. His daughter, Rosalind West, is in the gallery today. She's driven up from Melbourne today to hear these remarks. Alan's life was long and rich, and as a teacher and as an anthropologist, as a museum curator and as a member of the Labor Party. It was a life of commitment to principles and to social justice, particularly in relation to Australia's First Peoples. As the son of a locomotive driver, John and Mother Millie and Alan West was born in 1929 in a small town of Witchyproof, Victoria. At the beginning of the Depression, the family moved to Coburg in Melbourne, where his father trained and worked as a government health inspector. As a young man in the late 1940s, Alan began studying theology and moved to Echuca, where he worked as a junior clerk at the Commonwealth Bank. And at the invitation of the minister of the church he attended, he regularly assisted with the conduct of services at Aboriginal community at Kurrumjunga across the river in New South Wales. It was here that he observed firsthand the blatant discrimination and the repressive and racist paternalism of the government. And against this direct experience, Alan determined that he would dedicate his future work to advance the social, educational and the human rights of Aboriginal people. And for the rest of his life, he did exactly that. Having completed his theological training, Alan intended to work at one of the Churches of Christ Aboriginal missions in Western Australia, but found that he needed a further qualification as a teacher. And in 1951, and soon after his marriage to Doreen Keats, he began his training as a primary school teacher and qualified in 1953. From 1954 to 1958, he taught at the Government Aboriginal School at Rowlands in Western Australia and the Leaderville Primary School also in Western Australia. And in 1960, he joined the Victorian Aboriginal Welfare Board as a social worker. This brought him into contact with many Indigenous communities and families. And in his determination to make a difference to their lives, he faced many challenges. More often than not, with more bureaucratic office-based managers within the Welfare Board. But he never shirked these challenges. In 1966, in response to the worsening conditions at Lake Tyers Mission Station at Lakes Entrance, Victoria, Alan was appointed as the manager to address these issues. He and his family moved onto the station and he made a number of immediate changes to improve the conditions of residents. And it is there that he formed lifelong friendships. Alan compiled a report and a series of recommendations for reform. However, his recommendations for reform were rejected by the Welfare Board and Alan resigned. His fundamental principles could not be compromised. In 1962, Alan had completed a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology under the renowned anthropologists Roland and Catherine Barnt at the University of Western Australia and at the Postgraduate Diploma in Social Sciences at the University of Melbourne. In 1967, he was appointed as the Curator of Anthropology at the then National Museum of Victoria, now Museum Victoria. From 1967 to 1980 and from 1983 through to 1986. And then in the intervening 3 years, he was the Director of the Australian Council's Aboriginal Arts Board. Alan's first task in the museum was to coordinate the relocation and the rehousing of the entire Indigenous Cultures collection. Significantly, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Alan initiated the removal of Indigenous skeletal ancestral remains from the exhibition in the museum. And in that respect, for the cultural protocols, similarly removed the secret and the sacred men's ceremonial objects from public display. Alan was a member of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, now the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, from 1968. He was a founding member of the Victorian Archaeological and Aboriginal Relics Preservations Committee, an inspector under the Archaeological and Aboriginal Relics Preservation Act 1972. Now, and in these roles, he recommended that the Mount William Axe Quarry near Lancefield, Victoria, be declared a site of cultural significance and thus protected under the Act. During this time, as the curator at the museum, he published extensively on the Australian Indigenous material culture. He conducted fieldwork, highlighted by the documentary films on artefact manufacture and taped interviews with community leaders in Victoria and in Central Australia and Cape York. And two of these documentaries featured his friends from Lake Tyers, Foster Moffat and Albert Chopper Haynes, demonstrating traditional Lake Tyers canoe making and recorded Thelma Carter's skills as a basket maker. Alan's primary research is still being called on today, and without doubt, one of the most significant contributions was his research and work as a definitive manuscript on Tasmanian fibre practice and basket making. Now, copies of this manuscript continue to circulate amongst Aboriginal women of Tasmania, and it is regarded as the seminal impetus for the resurrection of contemporary basket making practice. In addition, Alan's work with Aboriginal communities laid the foundation for many long-standing partnerships. He supported his old friend, the late John Sandy Atkinson, in establishing the boomerang keeping place in Shepparton, Victoria, that opened in 1974 with objects on loan from the museum. In 1980, he completed a master's qualifying course in the Division of Prehistory at the La Trobe University under Dr. Ron Vanderwall. In 1999, the Museum Victoria published Alan's thesis as a monograph, Aboriginal String Bags, Nets and Cordage, which widely consulted by community members and researchers. And as a secondary school publication, Contact and Australian History, co-edited by D. Pound and R. Miller in 1985, it is still being used as a textbook in Australian schools. Alan developed many new exhibitions and actively initiated visits and engagements for the Indigenous community members in the museum itself. These engagements introduced a whole generation of Indigenous people to the collections of their material cultures and laid the foundations for the partnerships that have continued into in contemporary times. From his retirement, Alan continued to provide information on the material culture to senior and new staff in the Indigenous cultures and to researchers and to cultural heritage officers within the Office of Aboriginal Affairs within Victoria. And this is an invaluable, providing the memories that continue to enhance the collection's catalogues and records right up to his last months. The state of the collections, the documentations and the department records are evidence of his extensive, generous, knowledgeable and ongoing contribution. They are also evidence that Alan West has been one of the most valuable curators in the history of the museum. And in recognition, in 1986 he was appointed as an honorary associate of the museum, and in 2013 he was awarded the position of Curator Emeritus. Alan's social conscience extended beyond the Indigenous communities. In 1970, the Victorian state elections, he stood as a Labor candidate, representing the seat of Scoresby. He received the highest number of preference votes of 42.4%, representing a swing to Labor of some 4.2%. Although receiving the highest first preference votes for Labor ever obtained in this seat, he narrowly lost on preferences. He stood on one more occasion in 1973, but of course the Liberals held the seat. Now, nonetheless, Alan's commitment to Labor principles and social justice have never waned. His commitment to teaching extended into his role as a senior curator, and his legacy is firmly and permanently etched in the records of Museum Victoria, and of course in the memories of all those that he has mentored. His commitment to the causes of Australian Indigenous peoples has never waned. The wonderful glint in his eye that he dryly and irreverently commented on, the pretentious and somewhat bureaucratic approach, will of course be remembered by all those that knew him. We are very fortunate in Australia that there are people out there with a social conscience. They fight for social justice, they fight with principle and with integrity. They fight for all of us, but particularly those that are most disadvantaged. We should all be thankful for the fine, noble Australians like Alan West. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Siewert.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. Tonight I'd like to speak about this country's shamefully low New Start and youth allowance rates. Not long ago, in fact it was in the last sitting, I